Every who down in Who Newville liked the holidays a ton. But where to get great prices on gifts, they had no idea. None. They searched and they searched for great gifts under $25. Gifts for spouses and friends and even their toddlers. When suddenly one who shouted, Walmart has what you want, knowing they have Lego, Tree Hut, and no prices to flaunt. So they enjoy the holiday season as Who's often do. Cheering and shouting, Walmart has incredible gifts. Who knew? Find gifts they'll love under $25 at Walmart.
It's really hard these days to disappear. There's just too much surveillance overall on the internet, in our physical daily lives. So, he's, whether he's going through the woods of New Hampshire or going through the streets of Moscow, you're seen. And you want to stay unseen as much as possible in order to survive.
Welcome to the Spymasters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. I'm a writer and a journalist, and it's my mission to bring you interviews with the best writers about spies, fact and fiction, historical and contemporary. My guest this time is the best-selling novelist Joseph Finder. Joseph is the author of 17 novels, some of which are prize-winning, 2 of which have been made into films, High Crimes and Paranoia. We're here to talk about his latest novel, though, The Oligarch's Daughter. It's his best ever book, according to Stephen King, which is quite the accolade. It's a high-octane thriller which follows a man on the run from shadowy Russian operatives. His mistake was to fall in love with the oligarch's daughter, and it's an unput-downable read. We've got plenty more brilliant writers coming up on the Spymasters podcast, so make sure you follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe, tell your friends, help us keep bringing you brilliant writers talking about spies. And now I'll hand you over to me talking to Joseph Finder about the oligarch's daughter. Joseph, thank you so much for joining me on the Spymasters podcast. It's really lovely to have you on.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you're an incredibly prolific writer, but we're here to talk about your latest book, which is called The Oligarch's Daughter. And I have to say, I absolutely adored it. I couldn't put it down. It was an absolute rush.
Thank you.
Could we just maybe start? Could you just lay out the premise of the book? I think somebody I read called you the master of the hook. So if you could tell us what the hook is of this one.
Well, it's about a regular guy who meets a photographer in New York City and begins dating her, and they fall in love. And he later learns that she is the daughter of a Russian oligarch. Once that happens, the American intelligence agencies begin to take an interest in him and want him to start working on their behalf to inform on his father-in-law, this billionaire Russian oligarch. And naturally, our hero's life is turned upside down, and he is forced to go on the run. So that's the basic setup of the story.
So it's split into a dual timeline narrative. So in the present, our hero Paul is on the run from some heavies, and there's a sort of fantastic authenticity to him running through the woods and kind of using all this extraordinary kind of bushcraft that he's learned from his off-grid father. I loved all of that. Where did that all come from?
Yeah, well, it sort of gradually grew out of the fact that I wanted to have a character who was living under an alias, living under a false identity. And I said to myself, is that even possible anymore? Can you live off the grid, as it were? Can you really live under an assumed identity in this world in which we have CCTV cameras and Google and Facebook and all that kind of thing? Is that even possible? So I talked to a few experts who specialize in disappearing, going off the grid. And some of them are bogus, and some of them are for real. And one of them I talked to said the key thing is you can only use cash. You cannot set up a bank account, because once that happens, you are drawn to the attention of the tax authorities, and they will hunt you down.
Can I just go back a sec? There are people whose literal jobs have set themselves up as kind of consultants in how to disappear.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. And they write books. And again, some of them are not for real and some of them are. And it took took some calling around for me to find someone who really knew what he was talking about.
Right. Your hero, Paul, in the kind of present day, he spent some years living a kind of cash-based life, which in itself was extraordinary. I don't know what it's like in the US, but in London, you literally, nobody takes cash anymore. I couldn't conceive of a world without tapping on my phones.
And he's living in a small town in New Hampshire, and he is a boat builder, a shipbuilder, and he takes all of his commissions in cash only. And that is okay with some people and not okay with other people, but he has enough customers to stay in business. And so until one day when something happens and he realizes the bad guys are on him. This is after 5 years of living his false identity. He's able to escape them for 5 years.
I love that the opening of the book made me understand this sobriquet, the Master of the Hook, because it sort of opens where he realizes that he's been found and he's got a go bag, which I also really love the detail that he's got like this bag of kit that he's assembled, but then when he actually starts trying to use it, like the lighters run out of gas and he's got the wrong shoes on.
Exactly. I wanted to sort of make the point with that first of all, he was in a rush getting out of the house. He didn't bother to check over his kit in the go bag. And the second thing is that he is kind of rusty after all these years. He learned from his father how to live in the wilderness, but it's been years since he's done anything like that. So I wanted to make it clear to the reader that Paul is not, he's sort of on his back foot. He's sort of at the mercy of his equipment, and his equipment is not all there.
Yeah, and then he tries to remember little bits of bush lore that his dad's taught him, like the moss going in a certain direction tells you which way is north, but he can't remember which direction. Meanwhile, there's like dodgy Russians hunting him through the wood. And all of that obviously is in contrast to his life before. So he's in New York, he's a hedge fund manager, and he meets the sort of glamorous but not too glamorous Tatiana.
Not beautiful, but attractive in a certain way to him.
Yeah, who's living as a photographer in a slightly crumbly apartment. Although it's, as he sort of initially thinks, even this crumbly apartment is in New York, right? And you're supposedly a photographer. How is this working out? And then he said,
how is she supporting herself as a photographer? Right. And, she's good as a photographer. She's talented. You can see that. But still, living in Manhattan, in the East Village, is not easy if you don't have family support. And
I thought she was such a fascinating character. I am actually completely drawn to stories about the poor little rich girl whose life, from the outside looks utterly gilded. But when you meet her, she's really trying quite hard, like lovely apartments paid for by daddy accepted, to make her own way in the world. But everything she does, she's just in her father's shadow, and she's got no possibility of breaking free from that. And I felt that was really beautifully done, because she sort of tries to break free, but on the other hand, what's the point? Daddy's got like hundreds of billions of dollars.
Correct. Exactly. And she has a show at a gallery for her photographs, and Paul goes and he's blown away by how beautiful everything is, how great she is as a photographer. And her brother, who's kind of smarmy, her brother says, it's hard to believe that she actually got a gallery interested in her. And Paul sort of wonders what's going on until he overhears someone saying that her father owns the gallery. And it's kind of heartbreaking, I thought.
It's kind of heartbreaking. I mean, funnily enough, one of my sisters went to school with the daughter of a famous oligarch who should become nameless in case he hunts me down through the woods. And she was a deeply, deeply unhappy child.
Wow.
She was raised by a series of nannies. She never saw her parents. It was the bodyguards who took her to school. And she had very complicated relationships with all the other girls because the money was so distorting.
Exactly right. Exactly. And in fact, I knew someone who dated the daughter of a Russian oligarch and had the same experience. that she was a very unhappy woman. She was surrounded by bodyguards. Whenever they went out, they had to be accompanied by security, right? And she was distrustful of people who she didn't know whether people were friendly to her simply because she had a lot of money. So she was unable to sort of establish genuine relationships. And that is damaging. That is hard.
Right. I think
across, it's not just a sort of, wouldn't this be a great fantasy to have all this money? It's actually, in many ways, very difficult, and I wanted to get us to see that.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think you definitely do. And I felt also that the sense of purpose that one gets from making one's own money and striving and having a meaningful job, and she's sort of trying to do that, but she's only ever playing, and that's kind of destructive to one's soul, I think.
Right. That's exactly right. And this woman's named Tatiana, and he really loves her. And then when he meets her father and sees where her father lives in 2 huge townhouses put together on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, he says, "Why did you not tell me who you were?" And she says, "Because I was afraid you'd break up with me if I did."
I loved the conceit as well that he's a hedge fund manager when they meet, and his friends, because they all think she's a struggling photographer, are worried that she's a gold digger. And I love the fact that you had this conceit that the kind of the slightly cynical hedge fund manager was the poor moral center of a book. Like, normally you don't expect that.
That's right. Yeah, his friends accuse her of being a gold digger, and they have no idea what the real situation is. Who's the real rich one? Because by comparison with this oligarch, he's poor,
Yeah. And then, obviously, I don't want to give away anything that's entirely pertinent to the plot, but that he gets enmeshed in the life of his new kind of Russian family, and then he ends up also coming to the attention of the American security services, and then at different points also then the Russian security services. So at times he's like lost in a maze. He doesn't really know who is who and what's going on.
Right. Who we can trust.
And absolutely, yeah, who you can trust. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I thought it was obviously a big theme of your novel is the blurring of lines between kind of capitalism and intelligence, I guess, or the kind of practice of intelligence in Russia. One of your characters said at one point, he says, I'm going to read it out to you, this isn't the Cold War. It's not like the capitalists versus the communists. These guys are all on the side of capitalism. They're on the side of making money, which is our side, right? And the book very cleverly explores why it is not the same thing at all. Russian capitalism backed up by the former agents of the FSB.
Yeah, there's this great mythology of the Cold War that it was communists versus capitalists. And anyone who paid any close attention to that realized that some of these communists were capitalists, some of these capitalists were communists. That was kind of an artificial distinction. And I think that that one of the things I'm trying to get across in this book is that we are in many ways very similar to the Russians in the sense that everybody wants a good standard of living. Everybody wants to make money, and yet we don't know. We're unable to trust the other side. They're unable to trust us. And, the other thing I was kind of fascinated by as I was writing this book is you see a straight line from the Tsarist Okhrana to the FSB today. And the Tsarist secret police protected the Romanovs, had absolutely similar methods and practices as the FSB today. There is I learned recently that Vladimir Putin has had on his desk when he was a kid a portrait of the founder of Soviet military intelligence, a man named Berzin. And Berzin is a name that pops up in The Oligarch's Daughter.
Of course, yes.
So, I'm
appalled that I didn't make that connection. I've interviewed an academic who'd written a book about the FSB, and he was saying that they even, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the FSB actually dug out some old Okhrana teaching materials and started using them again, and within the service themselves making the connection, because I guess the KGB had kind of saw itself as originating with the Chekist kind of
yes.
thing, and not so much going back to the Okhrana, but the FSB explicitly reinvigorated those kind of historic links for itself as part of its kind of mission building.
Yeah, and that's sort of similar to what Putin was all about. He was barred from joining the Young Pioneers as a kid. He was disappointed by the way the communists handled the gradual dissolution of the Soviet Union. He was really let down by how Gorbachev let the Soviet Union collapse. So, and you see Lenin's in his mausoleum today, but because Putin hasn't decided what to do with the mausoleum. It's still there. You can still visit for 15 hours a week. But Lenin is no longer the saint that he was. And Putin is ambivalent about Lenin and about the communist legacy. So I think that it makes sense that the FSB would go back to the czarist roots of intelligence rather than purely Dzerzhinsky's Chekhov.
One of your characters makes the explicit point, actually I highlighted it, she says, for 1,000 years Russia has had an imperial court in one form or another, and anyone interested in power in this court develops at least three faces, and she talks about the three faces. But I mean, I thought that was an interesting thing, because it's that, I guess, continuity between Putin's kind of imperial ambitions, the Soviet imperialism, which was just imperialism and, you know, with a kind of ideological guise, and then going back further. And I thought that was really interesting, that without being heavy-handed, because after all, this is a thriller, your book seemed to me to be very rooted in a specific view of a kind of, you know, expansionist Russia.
That's right, which goes back to the beginning of the empire. And, you know, in some ways, the Soviet Union was a deviation, not in terms of empire building, but in terms of the ideology from the straight line that was Russian empire.
So your oligarch characters, again, without going too deep into things that might be spoilers, part of the book is an origin story about how the oligarchs came in and sort of pretty ruthlessly carved up the assets of the collapsing Soviet empire. And I thought that was all very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the oligarchs, if you think of the term oligarch, which is what the rule of by few, the oligarchs were truly kingmakers when the Soviet Union collapsed. They basically re-elected Yeltsin. They nominated and essentially elected Putin. They made Putin the successor to Yeltsin. And then as soon as Putin came into power, he called the oligarchs in for a meeting in the Kremlin a few months after he took power and said, okay, now, you want to keep your fortune? You want to keep your yachts and your real estate? Stay in your lane and stay out of politics. And most of them got the message, but a few did not. He was confronted by a couple of them, and one in particular, Khodorkovsky, he had arrested, put on trial, and sent to the Gulag. So I think at that point, the oligarchs got the message, stay out of politics. So today, we have oligarchs in the United States, for instance, and they are quite powerful in politics, these tech billionaires. But the oligarchs in Russia are forced to stay out of politics. They are in many ways less powerful than real oligarchs in the United States.
One of your characters makes a joke about oligarchs having a tendency to fall out of high windows.
That's right. Yeah, there's the joke in the book about the oligarch advent calendar. where you open a window and Oligarch falls out. Yeah, I mean, basically that is the distinction between oligarchs in the U.S. and oligarchs in Russia, which is that when the oligarchs in Russia get involved in the wrong sorts of politics, they have a tendency to fall out of the window.
And obviously it all makes for extraordinarily fertile material for writing thrillers. Your Hero Goes to Moscow at one point. I note from looking you up that you did Russian studies at university, so you've obviously had a long-standing interest in and expertise in Russian culture and history. You know, presumably, have you been to Russia?
Yes, number of times, yeah.
Yeah, and that came across. We've talked a little bit about the historical continuity. In your time of writing about and visiting Russia, do you feel there's a kind of cultural continuity, or is it a very different place from when you were doing your Russian studies at university I was about to say all those years ago. That's horribly rude, but
That's all right. It was a while ago. Yeah, I mean, Russia today looks different and feels different in many ways, but I really see there being a cultural continuity. Russian culture is rich and beautiful, and Russian families are warm and inviting. And this is one of the things that really sort of got Paul about Tatiana, was her family. So he really sort of becomes enamored of Arkady, her father, who may be malign in some ways. Maybe we don't know what he's all about, but he's kind of a scary guy, and yet to Paul, he is this sort of good, fun-loving, good time family man.
Right, and it's interesting. So Paul, you obviously quite deliberately made him a man who doesn't have family. He has a sort of absent, very peculiar father, and his mother died when he was young, which was obviously very painful. So then when he meets this warm and loving family, he is very willing to overlook the potential sinister side, which I guess from a kind of writerly craft thing, you need to happen, because otherwise, you've got this kind of clever hedge fund manager. He's got to somehow be seduced into,
Right. He has to be seduced into this world, and it's not the money, because he's got money. I mean, again, as I said, he's a pauper compared to the Galkins, to Arkady Galkin and his family. But I wanted there to be a lure to the personal side, the family side.
Although there is this character who I actually completely adore, who is the stepmother, who's a couple of years older than Tatiana, barely, and is in this constant, rather hilarious competition with her. She reminded me, I don't know if she's supposed to, but she did remind me terribly of Melania Trump.
Yeah. Which is very competitive with Tatiana.
Yeah, and they have this sort of and even the sort of way she paints her nails is pointed. And every time she greets her, she goes in and she says, she says to her stepdaughter Tatiana, she's like, I could never get away with that outfit. And it,
right. I'm amazed you could wear something like that.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's one of the things I really enjoyed about the book most was that, sometimes I find when you read a kind of thriller, sometimes the characterization can feel a little flat. But I felt very strongly that you had an ability to sort of do that kind of one pen stroke that brought a character off the page. And I really appreciated that. There's minor characters like Polina.
Yeah, thank you.
So in terms of then how the plot goes, the other thing that I really thought was clever in terms of kind of the craft of writing the book is, as I say, there's this dual timeline. So in half of it, Paul is kind of trying to escape from followers through the forest. And then in another bit of it, which you're reading concurrently, he's in Moscow trying to kind of work out who he can trust and get around without being seen. And I felt it was so interesting the way that you managed to create those two parallel worlds, which seemed so similar, of being in this threatening environment that you're trying to work your way through with a kit bag that that wasn't necessarily working for you.
Right. And then 5 or 6 years earlier, he's in Moscow trying to not be caught. and trying to do sort of spy stuff.
The spy stuff was really cool, but also I really loved, there was one of your characters, he says, it's another one of the things that I've highlighted, because I really love this, because obviously I interview a fair number of people who write modern spy stuff, and there's always this issue if you're writing modern spy stuff about what to do about the technology, because so much of the real technological world of spycraft these days is not like the fun John le Carré stuff. It's like people sitting behind computers. But obviously in this one, he gets out in the field, but he has to take into account the technology. And one of your characters, who's kind of trying to give him a crash course in how to survive, gives him an iPhone, and he says, they don't know you have this iPhone. It's called security through obscurity. He says, nothing is uncrackable anymore. So I loved that kind of sense that the only way that you cannot be tracked in a world of, constant surveillance is to be invisible in the first place.
Right. And to be obscure as much as possible, because anything is crackable. And the spy has to keep that in mind if he's trying to disappear.
It's really hard to disappear. Because he keeps trying to disappear in all sorts of different ways, but it's so hard.
It's really hard these days to disappear. There's just too much surveillance overall on the internet, in our physical daily lives. So, he's, whether he's going through the woods of New Hampshire or going through the streets of Moscow, you're seen, and you want to stay unseen as much as possible in order to survive.
Yeah, so he's in Moscow, he's like juggling two iPhones, one of which is known about, one isn't. In the woods in New Hampshire, he literally takes a rock and just smashes his iPhone into a million pieces because he doesn't know how else.
Yeah, he doesn't know whether he'll be tracked via this iPhone. And do you remove the SIM card? What do you do? Nobody knows. The technology is so advanced. He eventually has to take a rock and crush it.
I know he does. It made me kind of feel like my iPhone suddenly was very sinister. I was thinking, who's watching me? But then was that part of your decision making as well? Obviously, Paul is an amateur. He's an innocent. He doesn't mean to get involved in this world. This world kind of finds him. Talk to me about why that was. Why is this not a kind of traditional, agency versus agency type?
Well, I am much more interested in the ordinary man or woman who gets caught up in a situation that's beyond his or her control. I find that format more interesting than the professional spy versus the professional spy. So when we have somebody who is completely ordinary, and he's got certain skills, he speaks a little bit of Russian, and here's why he spoke Russian. He knows how to survive in the woods, but not really that well survive in the woods. He's he's a smart, clever person, but he's facing down, several intelligence agencies. And that is, to me, suspense.
Right. I mean, I found, actually his interactions with the American intelligence is kind of almost as sinister as his interactions with any others, because he doesn't really know what they want from him. He doesn't know who he can trust. And the fact that they, early on, when he meets them early on, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say there's a sort of special unit that's investigating his father-in-law, and even that special unit has to be sort of isolated because of that being penetrated. So, there's smoke and mirrors within the smoke and mirrors, which makes it really hard for them.
Which, again, makes it hard to trust, Just because he's an American, that doesn't mean he can trust the FBI or the CIA. He doesn't know who's up to what the bureaucratic games are, what the behind-the-scenes politics are. He has no idea any of this kind of stuff.
Yeah. And he asked as well about that, the issue of, I guess it may be because it's quite an issue here in London about the oligarchs with extraordinary amounts of money and how they kind of distort and get involved in politics and a city in a way that feels occasionally unhelpful, to say the least.
London grad, right.
London grad, right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's the other thing I found really interesting was the way these oligarchs have impressed themselves into society in the West. They basically fund political parties. There's a son of a KGB agent in the House of Lords, which I still find amazing to think about. And, it is a world of huge, almost incalculable wealth. And the Russians at first went over to the UK with briefcases full of cash. And just figured, we'll hire lawyers who will defend us and will get us out of trouble and will get us buy real estate for us and eventually buy citizenship if we wanted that. And it's all about, there's this great book by Oliver Bullock called The Butler to the World, where England essentially helped these oligarchs to take over many aspects of British society.
And also sort of launder their reputation in a way. And I was talking to one of my previous guests who'd written something involving Russian oligarchs, and she'd done quite a lot of work on the fact that art is such a useful way to launder your money. So,
yes.
So all the oligarchs who were, she said, just terrible people buying terrible paintings for extraordinary sums.
Right. And all in order to take this cash they can't use and put it into an asset that they can use or sell. Yeah.
Again, it's one of those wonderful things. So your book is so cleverly constructed that there's always sort of converse relationships with each other. So the idea of these oligarchs with like brimming of cash, which they're trying to make into sort of legitimate money, and then Paul running, doing this boat building business in his new life where he's eking out a subsistence on what cash he can persuade people to give him. It's all these strange parallels all the way through that I thought were really interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I ask about, I thought I could spot some influences on the work, but could you tell me who do you look up to most in terms of writers?
I look up to Eric Ambler because I love the ordinary man aspect of Ambler, Graham Greene, obviously John le Carré, but also there are aspects to Ken Follett and Frederick Forsyth, both very original writers who sort of created aspects of the spy genre that I think they're not given credit for. Really.
I think sometimes when writers make it look easy, even when it isn't easy, I think maybe that people underestimate them.
I think that's right. I mean, if you look at The Day of the Jackal, that is an original piece of work. And it's kind of amazing the way that it felt like a documentary, and you're seeing exactly how an assassin would go about his business, whether it's the armorer or the passport, getting a passport, any of these things, which Frederick Forsyth was able to use his journalistic background to document. And I wanted to incorporate some of that, I call it Forsythia, into my book because I love the real life details. And I think that this is what makes a story feel authentic.
I completely agree with that, actually. So in my other hat, well, I've got a few hats, but in one of them I review historical fiction for a newspaper. And in historical fiction, it's a similar kind of thing in that it's the judiciously placed detail that creates a world. Too many details and it's too much and it's boring.
Right. Got to be like an iceberg and you only see the top 10%.
100%. Right. And I completely felt that when reading your book, actually. It's one of the things I really enjoyed was the world building without going over the top. But yeah, with the details. 100%.
Just the right details as much as possible. Yeah. And not too much. Yeah.
There's a sense of a renaissance for spy fiction particularly. And I wonder if you are, obviously you're quite venerable now, but are you aware of all the kind of younger people coming through and are any of those you're watching?
Yeah. I read and very much admire Charles Cumming, for instance. I think he's really terrific. I also really like Mick Herron quite a bit, who I think is incredibly funny and clever, as well as, he invented something that doesn't really exist, but it feels so real, the Slough House,
Well, I mean, if we're talking world building, I mean, he's pretty, those are pretty intense.
Absolutely. Yeah. There are younger spy writers in the U.S. I think it is David, do I have his name right? McCloskey, thank you.
Yeah.
Who I just read one of his latest book. He's good. He's got a good sense of humor. I think he's also very clever, and he has the advantage of having been in the agency, and he's able to communicate that bureaucratic swamp that is the CIA.
Yeah, well, I love the bureaucratic swampness. I mean, it's also kind of Mick Herron shtick as well. I did notice from your biography that you've been recruited by the CIA, but you were reticent about whether you actually turned up.
I realized that I would, if I joined the agency, I would be sitting at a cubicle translating Soviet agricultural journals from Russian to English, and in the wheat harvest in Uzbekistan or something. And I just sort of thought this could be much more interesting if I write about it and make it up rather than actually do the thing.
I think obviously your many readers will be delighted you took that path, and I'm sure that you're a loss to the CIA's agricultural department, but kind of been to
Sorry. Yes.
On that note, Joseph, I'd like to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I highly, highly urge all our listeners to run out and buy this book because it's an absolute corker. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow, tweet, spread the word so that we can keep bringing you more brilliant writers talking about spies. Don't miss an episode of the Spymasters podcast.